Excited to be here today with you, Sasha, and excited for even being part of the conversation with Newstate and the great work that y'all are doing. But I'll just kick off and say at C-BEN, we really start from a pretty simple belief, right? Learning should count, no matter where or how it happens, but it has to be trusted and verifiable. And right now we kind of are in this moment where skills are everywhere. Everyone's talking about skills in job descriptions. Skills are being used to talk about the future of hiring, but we know that skills alone just aren't enough. And I know that's part of what we're going to talk about today, but that's really where CBE and C-BEN comes in. So in our world, CBE, or competency-based education, isn't just a teaching model. It's really a system for building trust between learners, educators, employers, and policymakers. It's really the focus of our work is on making learning transparent and measurable, and something that can be portable with the human who actually has all that learning. So it allows work experience, military service, prior learning, all to kind of hang together into real value, whether that's for college credit, for a career, without though lowering the bar. So sometimes when people hear competencies or skills-based, they think it's about lower quality, and C-BEN would say, no, it's about raising the bar with transparent and verified skills. And that's a lot of the work we do. So we work with our colleges, employer partners, state systems, accreditors, associations to design that kind of skills-first future at scale. My background spans higher ed, K-12, and workforce. And so started my career as a high school English teacher and a high school principal, was the founding dean for a competency-based program, probably about 13 years ago now. Spent some time building and developing competency-based systems as a consultant at Entangled Solutions, and then spent some time at Guild, really focused on the workforce and how we can really empower frontline workers and create pathways for them that allow them to build on their skills and abilities. And so that's a little bit about me. Sasha, happy to dig into any piece, but really excited for the conversation today. C-BEN, we define a competency as the knowledge and skills that you need paired with the ability and the behavior or the dispositions. So we would say like listing a skill is not enough. So for example, I can use Excel. That's a skill, but that's not really the skill that we need, right? You need to know if I can analyze financial information under a deadline and actually make a recommendation. That is a competency, right? Is to be able to actually pair my skill, being able to look at an Excel or use an Excel sheet, with application in context. And so when we talk to employers, honestly, across literally any field, if I'm talking about nursing, education, cybersecurity, they talk about skills last. They talk about behaviors and dispositions first. They will say things like, I need a nurse who can demonstrate compassion and empathy. I need a teacher who can receive feedback under pressure and still keep going. And they're talking about dispositions and abilities. And so a competency really is that full package. You still need the knowledge, you still need the skill, but we need to pair it with application and behavior for it to be a full competency and not just a rote set of skills that people have. A skill is not enough in our world. I think there's a few things that honestly, like, employers and education providers kind of get wrong here. One is they tend to confuse exposure with mastery. So because I spent X amount of time doing something, that means I have a demonstrated ability to do it. And we know that that's not necessarily true. I could sit in an accounting course for the same amount of time as someone else, and I guarantee I will still be a very bad accountant. It does not mean that I have the demonstrated ability that's needed on the job. And so what we need is for systems, to move from a system that's looking at time and exposure into a system that is really looking at the verified skills and abilities that we need. So one thing that we all get wrong is confusing time with mastery or proficiency. I think the other thing that probably more employers get wrong than educators is that we tend to treat skills as like an isolated checkbox, right? And so when we over engineer each individual skill and feel like, oh, we have a complete skills list, we kind of over atomize it and we lose coherence or context, because skills don't live in isolation, right? I don't just go do a skill and come back. It's always in context. And so we need to be thinking about that. And the last thing I'd say, and this gets at, Sasha, what you just said, like, we don't define performance levels, right? And so we have to be thinking about it. C-BEN, we call this levels of mastery or performance indicators. Like, we don't just want someone who has nursing skill. We need a person who can triage under stress, who can make safe decisions. And we need to be able to clearly define that. And that's where we tend to get it wrong, is we might say something like, as educators, oh, you get critical thinking through gen ed programs or through liberal arts. Well, how do we know? What does that look like? And employers simultaneously are saying we need critical thinkers, and the two teams aren't talking to each other to really define what that looks like in action to be able to kind of create a coherent program. So that's kind of, those are at least the three big areas where I see folks kind of getting it wrong. And that's where I think CBE really can deliver on bridging a gap. Really where this kind of, what it comes down to me, at least, Sasha, is really like, how do we verify skills and trust that in kind of a scalable way? And so when employers are saying things like, we're going to do away with the degree requirement and we're only going to focus on skills, the reality is, like, most of those employers don't have the system or the mechanism to actually do that, right? Like, they're still they're saying that, but they're still relying on that degree because we don't have any other way right now, for the most part, to really verify that learning. And so I think the real question here becomes, like, who verifies competency or performance, and how transparent and trustworthy is that verification? And so for learning providers and education providers, and I think this is part of what Newstate is doing, is like really focusing in on, these are the competencies that you need. And this is the performance-based assessment that we will use to verify that. And you're making that very transparent for the learner and for the employer. And I think that's kind of step one. And what I would say is, we don't have to get bogged down in like exact terminology. There was a push for a while of like, we all have to speak the same language. I've like given up that. I'm not going to die on that hill anymore, because everyone uses different words, but can we agree on what what good performance looks like? Can we agree on durable competencies that transcend any job, that we just all know we need to be working toward, regardless of what job we have and how it's transferred? And I think that's really where the opportunity is to just be very clear on, like, this is the level of performance and this is how we know you have it. And if we can get to that place as learning providers and as educators, then we can give employers a signal that they trust to use for skills-based hiring. What this comes down to, just from like an operational perspective too, is that we have to have interoperability and digital credentials, but like that, all of that push toward like a verified learning and employment record or a verified skill only matters if it's backed by a trusted signal, if it's backed by a real assessment. So a badge or a micro credential without evidence behind it is just really good marketing, right? So like, how do we actually make sure that we have a record of someone's validated performance? And if we have that, it can become a signal to the learner and to the employer. And I think that's where kind of there's a real opportunity for employers, tech providers, and educators to come together and say, like, okay, this is what it needs to look like for it to be a trusted signal. And there's lots of good work happening within states to try to really supercharge kind of that learning and employment record, so it can be a source of truth for folks. So interesting that you asked that, because you're like reading my mind in terms of kind of my next thought here. I think the difference right now is that there is a real recognition that any one entity doing this in isolation is not going to succeed. And so we have seen lots of efforts to define skills, create a skills clearinghouse, use, this open badging system, whatever that is. And all of those things were kind of done like either for higher ed or for an employer or for, it's been rare that it's been for the human at the center. And I think what changed, Sasha, is this real shift to what do we design for human beings who have to operate in a work, learn, earn ecosystem throughout their life, right? From kindergarten all the way through to hopefully past retirement, you still would continue to learn. And I think what's happening is like we're bringing employers into the conversation. We are seeing, and C-BEN just recently received a grant for this, we're seeing kind of third-party quality assurance and validation. We're seeing transparent criteria, but we are seeing it focused around the human at the center and not focused around how do we do this for higher ed? How do we do this for an employer? How do we do this? How do we do this for people? And I think that this work can scale when it's collectively built without watering it down, and not when it's just done in isolation through these different efforts. And just to be clear, I don't want to throw shade on any of those isolated efforts because we learned from them, right? But the reality is coming together with employers, policymakers, and learning providers in service of the person that has to operate at the center of that ecosystem, I think is what I have seen, at least, that's shifted, particularly with this latest effort to really think about verification of skills. Where we can leverage AI in smart ways to help us actually create that interoperable ecosystem, like we need to lean into that. And a really good, honestly, example that we already have to rest on is the work that the state of Alabama did to create their interoperable records, where basically they take in-demand job criteria, they took information from, I think, 16 industry councils in that state. Learning providers came to the table, and instead of them agreeing on each individual competency or skill, they really leveraged AI to create a skills ontology and a skills framework that they could live with that would still help learners or humans at the center figure out where are their credentials of value that align to the jobs that I want to get, and how to do that. And so that is something that, Sasha, used to be such a manual process and tracked in spreadsheets and things like that. And now that can be something that AI is leveraging on the back end with the right human oversight. And then Amber, one of my colleagues here at C-BEN, she convenes those industry councils quarterly to look at the data, to look at the competencies. And what we see is like competency and skill crossover between certain industries that allow us then to remap jobs and look at things like where someone might be at risk of automation, what are the competencies and skills they have for the next job? And that kind of work can be done today, right? Leveraging AI. And I don't even know where the limit to that is, right? Like, I think if we just think that's what we can do today, then the future is really limitless in terms of what we could do. I'll also just name, it's a little bit scary too, right? Like where does the, how do we make sure we have a human at the center? How do we make sure we have a human in the loop, so to speak, as we design these systems, so we don't end up unintentionally designing something that really isn't working for every learner, for every person. And then on the flip side of this, on the AI question, this is like my soapbox, this is why it becomes so important for us to focus on durable skills that will be leveraged and used no matter what. So in a world where I can't predict the jobs of the future, there's a job that pays right now to be a real estate agent in the metaverse. And I always say, I don't even know what that means. I haven't looked it up, but it's a paying job. You can get paid as a social media influencer, which 15 years ago, if someone told me they were going to be a social media influencer and get paid, I would have laughed. But like Progressive here in Ohio hires social media influencers to help with their insurance business. If I was a higher ed leader, I can't predict those jobs and I can't design programs around them, but I can leverage AI to create a nimble curriculum. I can leverage AI to update content and make things more relevant for my learners. And I can leverage AI to help me make sure that that all of the things that I'm teaching are in service of a durable skill that will stand the test of time when this very specific nuanced program with its skills and content might not be relevant in 10 years. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity to use AI and to use kind of all the tech that now is at our disposal. Yeah, I tend to use at least durable skills more than anything. And I'll just say it's more than just saying I need a team player, I need a critical thinker. It's like when you say I need a team player, that's not enough. I need to know, what do you mean when you say that, right? And so what that means is you want someone who shows up on time. You want someone who actively participates and shares ideas. You want someone, and so it's like, to me, the durable skills, those are kind of out in the ether: critical thinkers, teamwork, collaboration, communication. Like that part is almost, I don't want to say not interesting. It's less interesting to me than like, let's actually go one click deeper, because it's not going to be enough for us just to say, these are the durable skills. We need to actually say, these are the kinds of behaviors that I want to see in my field or in the employees that I hire. And then they are trainable, and they are something we can teach if we're clear, right? And so the example that I give a lot is like, I don't have kids of my own, so bear with this analogy, but if you're walking into Walmart or Target with your kids, you might say to them, hey, I need you to behave. We're getting ready to go in the store. And then they walk in the store and they're poking at each other and they're throwing stuff from the shelf into the cart. They're fighting over something. They're crying because they want something. And you get to the car and you say, I don't know what that was, but that was not behaving. And inevitably they look at you and go, what do you mean? We were good. And it's like, yes. No one defined what the behavior was, and no one defined what good looked like. But if I say to them, we're going into the store, there's a couple rules. Don't touch each other. Keep your hands to yourself. Don't put anything into the cart without asking me. Like, those are two very specific things I can give them that they can then think about when they're getting ready to engage in a behavior. And I know that sounds really simple, but like, we don't do that for our adult learners, and we need to do that for our adult learners, and we need to do that with our employers and with our education providers. We need to say, what exactly is this defined capability? Because educators and employers still aren't speaking the same words. Educators talk in learning outcomes, Bloom's taxonomy, credit hours, like you mentioned, and employers are speaking in keywords and immediate performance on the job. If we don't do a better job of bridging that gap, we aren't going to be able to teach to those critical or durable or power or soft skills that we're talking about. And a good example that brings this to light is really just even in the nursing field. So we do a lot of work across nurses and across nursing schools and employers. And don't quote me on this exact stat. If I was smart, I would remember the exact number, but it's something like 30% of first-year nurses leave within the year. And we also have hiring partners, hospitals, et cetera, saying that nurses are not practice ready when they get on the job. It's not because they don't have nursing technical skill. They do. They had to pass an NCLEX test. They had to demonstrate skill in a clinical. Where they're falling off and why they're leaving the field early is because no one prepared them for the realities of what it is on the job. And so when we are preparing nurses, for example, in higher ed, to pass an NCLEX test, because that is the standard by which we are all judged as higher ed institutions, we are not spending time teaching them things like how to deal with a difficult patient, how to accept feedback from a doctor who's in a bad mood and is going to dismiss you immediately and not hear your concern. Is that going to ruin your day? How are you going to keep going? How are you going to keep talking to patients? And the reality is, if we could define that those are the kinds of things you have to do on the job, we can teach to those. I can create an assessment that is performance-based, based on case study, or we do a lot of live simulations with live actors to really simulate those stressful things. If we can do that, then we can have a verified, trusted signal, and we can help actually put a dent in the fact that nurses are leaving in droves in their first year. teachers are leaving in droves in their
Yeah.
And it's partly because we haven't done a good job of preparing them for the actual skills and abilities that they have to do on the job. One more example, Sasha, if you don't mind, that I'll use from just even teaching. We just did work with registered teacher apprenticeships in Tennessee. And when I met with 16 faculty across the state, they all agreed classroom management. We have to have teachers who can manage a classroom. Sure, that's like a no-brainer. Yeah, of course we need that. And I said, how do you assess that today? The vast majority said it's a 5 to 7 page essay on their personal theories of classroom management. And then they might do a diagram of what their ideal classroom looks like and explain how that supports classroom management. And that was literally the culminating assignment in a class really talking about classroom management. And I can tell you from experience that that will do nothing to prepare you for the first time you're in a room of 35 teenagers and one of them calls you a 4-letter word. What are you going to do in that moment? But I can simulate that for you so you can practice how you're going to deal with that in the middle of a lesson. And I know I can't recreate the exact same scenario for you, but I can at least give you some reps before you're just stuck in a classroom wondering, man, why did I write that 5 to 7 page essay? And just to be clear, it doesn't mean the essay was a bad idea. You still need to know the theory to understand how you might react to something and let that inform what you do. But like, this disconnect, we can't afford it anymore. Like the world's changing too fast and we need people, we need skilled workers, competent workers in the workforce. And until we can start to really weave that together, we're going to be in the same place that we're in right now with labor shortages. The one thing that I'll just say related to what you said is like, there's this matching piece, but where it gives me concern, honestly, is around kind of any cultural or biased behaviors that can be embedded in that. And so like, when we say like, oh, if you have social anxiety, maybe nursing isn't right, that's probably true, first of all. Second of all, is there a path where we can help that person get exposure to the job so they can make a decision for themselves? So I think it's both and, right? Like it's matching, it's acknowledging where your own dispositions might be, but then when we have educators, and I know you and I aren't in this boat, but when we have educators who say, well, you're either a good leader or you're not. You're either going to be good with patients and compassionate or you're not.
Right.
And we're really in bad shape because like those need to be teachable, fosterable, coachable skills and competencies. And so I think that's where even I monitor too, like, because having a taxonomy or a competency set is not going to be enough, right? That is just giving us the basic currency for communicating across educator, learner, policymaker, and learning provider, employer, right? That's just giving us the basis. And then there's so much more, right, that we have to do to be able to support both learners and employers in actually realizing skills-based hiring or economic mobility for someone. A couple thoughts. One is we just did some work with the American Association of Colleges of Nursing on this, where they have a competency framework for every nurse, right? And we had to go one layer deeper because they had a competency, for example, that was like demonstrate compassionate care. Well, we had to talk to employers to be like, what does that look like for you? What does that mean? Because that is such a lofty, big idea. And we met with employers, we met with subject matter experts, nursing faculty to kind of break that down a little bit. And where it's kind of like the Goldilocks equation is that you can't be so prescriptive that it becomes a checklist of performative actions, right? So we wouldn't want to say something like demonstrate compassionate care, smile, touch the patient on the shoulder. Like those become like very rote kind of things that's really not quite what we're looking for. But maybe we might say things like reflects back what the patient might be saying, tries to summarize their needs. Like there's a list of behaviors that is a little bit more still observable, has to be observable, just to be clear. But it's like the Goldilocks of observable, measurable, but also not just becoming this rote checklist of employers. And so I think that takes practice, and then it takes validation, and then using that on the job to see, is this really something we can do? And what I would say is where people get where minds start spinning is then people don't touch it at all. They say, nope, we just need compassionate care in the way Tom defines that, the way Lisa defines that, and the way Sasha defines that. They're just going to be whatever they are. That's not okay either. And so it is an opportunity to bring folks into the conversation to figure out what is the grain size of that. And the other thing I would say is after meeting with employers in lots of sectors, what they're asking for isn't that different. Like we hear, and this is anecdotal, but we hear from employers the same kinds of things across the field. And I think getting a level set on like what they need, I don't see that we have wildly varying expectations on the job for people. And so that's just the one side of like, bring them into the conversation, bring the right employers. If you're a regional or local or state employers, I don't see that there's a wide variety of expectations necessarily. What I see is that we need to have a conversation with them and then play around with the right grain size of that performance so that it's not super microtized, but also is still observable and measurable and allows for some nuance and context. We use that, those kind of behaviors that we work with employers to define, that then helps us create an assessment that allows someone to demonstrate those behaviors. And that's where the beauty of this works, right? Because you might demonstrate that on the job. You might demonstrate that through a simulation. You might demonstrate that through, and there's like lots of mechanisms by which you could show that behavior. And that's maybe where, to Tom's point, and to your point, like some of the real deep contextualization can come in. Like we know you have this behavior or disposition applied in this setting. Now we're going to work with you to apply it in this setting. And like even equipping an employer with that much information would be a pretty big step up from what we do today.